So they do have a place. Now during this presentation there will be slides that you won't be able to read because they're straight out of the newspaper, scanned out of the newspaper, but I'll read them out to you, so don't strain your eyes. Now, there were three different types of designs for the ships. The first of the barks were wooden ships, which were built naturally of wood. This included the frame of the ship and the hull. These then evolved into composite designs, where the frames were of iron and the hull was of timber. Finally, the iron ships, where both the frame and the hull were made of iron. As the designs changed, the ships got bigger. That is the engine room of a wool clipper. Now, beggars can't be choosers. I could only get a picture of a four-masted bark. All our wool clippers were three masts. And the confusing thing on all these, come back, wrong button. Second sail from the bottom is the top sail. If someone had said which is the top sail, I would have said the one right at the top. But now, the history of the clippers. The wool clippers began servicing Launceston in 1827. They'd arrive in Launceston in spring and leave around New Year to arrive in London in time for the wool sales. The wool was dispatched on an advance upon purchase system. The wool grower would get part payment from the shipping agent and the remainder when the wool was sold. The first wool in received the best price, so speed was of the essence. If the wool arrived too late for the sales, it was put in storage at the Tasmanian farmer's expense. In 1847, Launceston businessman Henry Reed negotiated with Thomas Boss Walker in London for a direct shipping service, and this service is what this presentation focuses on. The wool clippers provided a vital link between England and Tasmania. They transported necessary goods and infrastructure to the developing areas and then returned to London with wool, gold, tin, timber, bark, animal skins, etc. These exports, especially wool, enabled places such as Launceston to flourish and become one of the richest towns in the country. The early architecture shows how affluent the region was. And if you've got any questions, just yell out. The ships would leave London and sail to Gravesend on the Thames, where they would load explosives. They'd then sail out into the English Channel and pass the Lizard. And the Lizard is marked on the map there. That's the southernmost part of England. It would take approximately 80 days, depending on the wind, to arrive in Launceston. They would sail south past St Paul's Rock, Trinbade and Tristan da Cunha, which is there somewhere. Then they'd engage with the Roaring Forties, which gave them good passage across the Indian Ocean. They would then sail onto Bass Strait, Low Head and the voyage up the Tamar to Launceston. If wind and tide weren't favourable, the steam tugs Waibia and Tamar would bring the ships along the Tamar River. The semaphore between Low Head and Windmill Hill, and later the telegraph, would alert the folk in Launceston of the impending arrivals, which usually brought great excitement. A number of captains and officers married local women, so their arrival in port was much anticipated. That map is fairly self-explanatory. One thing I have found out, and you probably already know, we're in the Roaring 40s, down below us is the Furious 50s, and down even lower than that is the Screaming 60s. Excuse me. I've lost the page. The first assignment for the incoming ships was to stop at Town Point and discharge the cargo of explosives. These were taken to the Launceston Explosives magazine, which was located upstream on the North Esk River on the Glebe River Flats. The magazine was accessed via an elevated narrow gauge tramway, and the buildings were hidden behind two earthen bunkers. The ships were then towed over the barway at the mouth of the North Esk and taken up to Queen's Wharf. This wharf on the southern side of the river extended from Home Point up to where the Victoria Bridge, or Tamer Street Bridge, is now. The masts that have been placed at the end of St John Street give an indication of what the vista would have been when looking north along St John Street. Alexandra Wharf was later built on the northern side of the river. Obviously, I haven't looked at that slide. Anyway, when the Aruna came in about 1867, she unloaded 6 1/4 tonne of gunpowder at Town Point, and the schooner Rubicon and the cutter Anne were engaged as lighters for her. They had to remove some of the cargo from her because she was too low in the water to get up over the rapids and the barway into the North Esk and up to the wharf. And that should have been on the slide. Now, that is a picture of a couple of the buildings where the Explosives magazine was. In behind Theogony's, in behind Glebe Gardens. Yeah. They have been taken over by a clothing company, the Spotted Quoll. I don't know how they're going to go in the next decent flood. They may have problems. A sketch of the river in 1833 shows the rapids and barway at both entrances to the North Esk River, and there were rapids in where the yacht basin is now. Oh, there's my slide. A view off the North Esk River showing Queen's Wharf in 1868, taken round about where the Tamer Street Bridge is now. I love this photo. Taken from round about the same place in 1885. Thank you. It's round the corner. They look magnificent. This photo is not dated, but it now shows Customs House there, and that was built in 1889. And that's 2022. I know which view I'd rather see. Looking back from the mouth of the North Esk up towards, right up in the corner is the Tamer Street Bridge, and sitting there quite majestically in the middle is the Eden Home. And one more showing the wharf all the way up to the Tamer Street Bridge. Now, some of the wool clippers that plied this route were the Arnhem, the Aruna, the Barine, the Asterope. There were 2 Westburys, Fugitive, Decapolis, Lanona, Corinth and the Eden Home. The Asterope, Fugitive and Eden Home were not owned by Mr. Walker. And when Peter suggested I give a talk, I thought on the way home, maybe the Asterope would be the best one. It only came in once. It would be a very short talk. Now, Mr. Thomas Boss Walker was a very prominent man among London ship owners and for many years was chairman of Lloyd's Register. He was a shipmaster of the old school and took a great pride in his ships and kept them up in most liberal fashion. One of his customs was to keep officers and apprentices on board whilst the ships were at home, and an old pension cook going into the galley and acting as shipkeeper. Thus, the Walker apprentices had a most valuable training in docking and undocking, shifting ship, refitting rigging, bending and unbending sail, etc. And a further result of this custom was that these pretty little barks were kept in such good order, whilst at home they became to be known as the West India Dock Yachts. West India was the London dock for the Tasmanian bound ships. Bending and unbending sail. When they were in dock for the best part of 3 months, they'd remove some of the sails to repair or replace, and the act of putting the sails back on the spars, where they actually bent them over the spars and then tied them into place, was called bending sail. That took quite a bit of finding. Mr. Walker lived at Hackney and later at Snaresbrook, and he used to arrive at the docks punctually at 9:30 every morning. By this time, the decks of all the Walker clippers in port had been washed down, the ropes Flemish coiled, the brass polished, and everything was in order for his inspection. And everything had to be in perfect order, for he had an eye like a hawk, and nothing escaped him. The least thing wrong or out of order, and he was sure to detect it. His captains used to assemble together to meet him and make a daily report on their ships. After Mr. Walker had made his inspection, it was the long-established customs for his captains to conduct him to the West India Dock Station, where he entrained for his day's work in the city. Mr. Walker's first ship in the Tasmanian trade was the Arnhem in 1851, and his ships continued to ply the Tasmanian trade until his death in 1894. His remaining ships were sold 2 years later. The YMCA. The role of the YMCA in Launceston was significant. Either on the day of arrival or the next, a dinner would be held to welcome the captains and crews. The sailors would have no doubt welcomed a home-cooked meal following 3 months at sea. After their meal, there would be a formal welcome to Launceston, singing and a church service. The sailors were invited to attend the YMCA at any time during their stay for letter writing, meals and fellowship. There would also be a farewell dinner held before sailing, with well wishes for a safe and successful voyage. The Seafarer's Mission would have been an extension of that. Reading through the manifests of the incoming ships, it's interesting to reflect on which businesses, or some of the businesses, were in Launceston. W. Hart and Sons with hardware, Hatton and Laws with medicines, Irvin and McEachran with alcohol, Walsh Brothers and Birches with stationery, Richard G. school supplies and religious books, John Dunning had millinery, Hinman Wright building supplies, Joan T. Gunn building supplies, Frank Hart hardware, farming equipment, fishing tackle, Lindsay Tulloch general groceries, R.P. Dix drugs and photographic chemicals, and Shillington had clothing. Plus the Launceston and Western Railway. 2 powerful locomotives brought out by the Aruna for the Launceston and Western Railway have been safely landed. The great weight made the work of discharging them a rather arduous one, but thanks to the precautions used by Captain Whittingham, it has been safely accomplished. Both the ponderous engines being lowered onto the wharf in perfect safety. The first one landed has, by means of temporary tramway, the rails being laid as progress was made, been removed from the vessel to the terminus, and the second will follow soon as it has been raised onto wheels. The locomotives are from the establishment of Robert Stevenson and Co., and are each about 300 horsepower. That was in the Examiner on the 29th of November 1869. Can you imagine a locomotive, two locomotives being put in a sailing ship? They would have had to rip the deck apart to get them in, rebuild it, and then rip it apart. It's mind-boggling. The Arnhem was registered at 338 tonne. It was Mr. Walker's first wool clipper. She began servicing Launceston in 1851 and her last voyage home was 1857. On the 11th of January 1854, it was reported that the first wool ship, hence this season, is the brig Arnhem, Captain Barwood. She takes away 1,108 bales. The Asterapy. She was gross ton at 601 ton, gross tonnage 601 tonne. She was 172 feet long. She was launched in 1859 and was on the London-New Zealand run until 1882. She was then put on the Launceston run, which wasn't as successful as would have been anticipated. She was wrecked at Tamer Heads 8th of June 1883. The Asterapy under Master Stapleton left Gravesend, London for Launceston on the 13th of December 1882, but when off the Lizard collided with an unknown vessel and lost her rudder. She was towed to Plymouth for repairs, then set out again on the 31st of January 1883. Rough weather forced her to return again, leaking badly. Sailing yet again on the 28th of February, she finally made it to Tasmania, only to run into Hebe Reef on the 8th of June. All was saved. Artefacts of the Asterapy are on display at the Maritime Museum. You'd think after the second try they'd have given up. And that is a photo of the Asterapy. The Barine. The Barine's first arrival in the Tamer was reported as follows on the 27th of January 1870. This would be the first of many arrivals leading up to her final voyage in 1895. The bark Barine, 526 tonne, Captain Wirral, was sighted 6 leagues off the Heads yesterday at 3:15 p.m. and entered at 6:45 p.m. The Barine sailed from Gravesend on the 31st of October, passed Deal on the same day. On the 7th of November she was off Brighton and the following day passed the Lizard, thus making the voyage from land to land in 79 days. The Barine brings a miscellaneous cargo and no passengers. The Barine was the pride of the fleet, and she was always described as Launceston's favourite ship. She first arrived on the 27th of January 1870 and continued visiting till her last sailing December 1895. The Barine and the Lenoma both have streets in East Launceston named after them. She had a raised quarterdeck 43 feet long, and this was laid with New Zealand Kauri pine planking, 4 inches wide, extending the full length without a butt, and what is more, without a knot. All the deck fittings, houses, spike rails, skylights and top-gallant bulwarks were of selected teak, the bulwarks being panelled with fretwork designs. The boats also were of polished teak. In fact, the only bit of painted wood about the decks was the longboat chocks. Even the bunk boards and lining of the fossil were of teak. Must have been a magnificent looking vessel. 22nd of December 1877. The bark Barine cleared for London on Wednesday with 1,313 bales of washed wool, valued at £29,832. 898 bales of greasy wool, valued at £15,661. £5,500 ingots of tin, valued at £9,570. Total value of cargo £56,433. This is said to be the largest shipment of wool from Launceston before Christmas in many years. And this is just one ship. 19th of December 1882, she left with £12,000 of ground bark, sheepskins, scoured wool, greasy wool, total value £52,455,000. Captain John Wirral. He looks like a sea captain too. Captain Wirral first took to sea in 1850. He is credited with 36 circumnavigations of the globe, 44 years in command of ships, 35 years on the Tasmanian trade. In all those years he was never in charge of a steamer. He was the captain of the Marine for all the years she came in. Captain Wirral was well loved by the Launceston community and was well respected by his crew. He ran a dry ship and held very strong Christian beliefs. He was also extremely generous when it came to the community. If there was a ball or civic reception, he would lend the organisers the bunting off the Marine. When concerts were held in the Cataract Gorge, it was the boats off the Marine that took choirs and orchestras up in the gorge. He was also well known for his contributions to the youth of Launceston area. He would travel as far as Perth to attend Sunday school anniversaries and donate books as prizes, books he had brought out from London. He was very much involved in the Wesleyan Church. When it was known in Launceston that Captain Wirral was leaving Tasmania homeward bound for the last time, with the intention of retiring from the sea, a meeting and public send-off were arranged, and a purse of sovereigns and an illuminated address were presented to the veteran captain by the mayor of the town. After several eulogic speeches, in which Captain Wirral was referred to as one of the most popular men ever connected with the shipping of Launceston. Like many other sailing ship captains, Captain Wirral was no mean surgeon, and the setting of broken limbs at sea held no terrors for him. He once made a very good job of his second mate's broken arm. He deserves a place in the history of Launceston. Don't try and read that. A moonlight excursion with music on the 16th of December 1872. On Thursday evening, all was prepared on board the bark Marine for what is now looked upon as an annual event. The members of the choir of the Wesleyan Church and a number of their friends were invited by Captain Wirral to meet on board. A vast awning covered in the quarterdeck, thus converting it into a spacious, airy saloon, and all was prepared for the invited guests, but the weather was so rough and threatening, the fete was postponed until Friday evening. At 7:30, the party having assembled, embarked in two large boats belonging to the Marine and pulled off towards the cataract. The choir sang several pieces on the way, and the sound came floating softly and melodiously off the water. The weather was suitable for such a trip. The moon shone so brightly that the party could read the music without any other lights. Sheltered in a sort of cove up the gorge, the party spent 2 hours very pleasantly. Some fireworks were set off, their light producing strange and beautiful effects on the surrounding romantic scenery. On returning to the Marine, the party found the tables in the saloon covered in very choice viands, and the trip having sharpened the appetites, the petite supper was very acceptable. After some more singing, the party broke up at 11 o'clock, regretting that time on such occasions slips away so rapidly. That would be the Corinth. Yeah, we don't have time to do this, I'm not going to take you to it. At 11 a.m, what have we got? 1885. At 11 a.m. on Saturday, a bark was sighted low head, distance 4 leagues, but she passed to the west at 11:45. At 1:45, sorry. She, however, turned up at 5:20 p.m. the same day, but passed out of sight again. It was not seen until 4:50 a.m. yesterday, when she hovered about, probably waiting for a fair wind to run in with. The vessel proved to be the bark Corinth from London, and she entered the heads at 11:25 a.m. This is the first visit of the bark to this port, but we may mention that she is a composite vessel and a sister ship to the bark Marine. Captain Littler, who is in command, has many friends in this port, although he has been absent from Launceston about 18 years. She was anchored in Lagoon Bay at 4 p.m. yesterday, but will probably reach Town Point today. Other imports. Imported birds by the bark Corinth, which arrived at Town Point yesterday from London. The following birds were imported: 6 pairs of Norwich canaries, 2 pairs lizard canaries, 1 pair Yorkshire canaries, 1 pair of South African parrots, 1 red-crested cardinal parrot, 1 pair of white parakeets, 1 English jay, and others. They are now on view aboard the vessel. A couple of very lovely birds there. They came out on their own. February 1893, the Corinth left with a cargo of wool and sundries to the value of £25,645, 11 shillings and twopence, which was significant because the Corinth was lost by spontaneous combustion. In February 1893, she sailed from Launceston in the wake of the Marine with a cargo of wool and skins under the command of Captain Littler. When she was a week out and about 300 miles southeast of New Zealand, signs of fire in the hold were discovered early on a Sunday morning. Prompt measures to fight the fire were at once taken. Everything was battened down, holes were cut in the deck, through which the hose was led, and the wool bales were soused with water. Nevertheless, the fire gained rapidly, and at 10 o'clock the same night, the ship had to be abandoned. The crew got safely away in 2 boats and headed for the New Zealand coast, but with little hope of making the land against the stormy weather of the prevailing westerly winds. After they'd been 5 days and nights adrift, the smoke of a steamer was sighted about sundown, then darkness set in. The provisions had become soaked in salt water, but the shipwrecked crew had managed to keep a few rockets dry, and these were sent up one after the other in the hope of attracting the attention of the steamer. At last, only 1 rocket remained, and after some discussion as to whether to risk it or keep it for a future occasion, it also was fired and was seen from the bridge of the approaching vessel. However, she showed no signs of having seen it in the way of an answering rocket or flare, so one can imagine the relief of the shipwrecked crew when her masthead and later her side lights were seen, steering end on for the boats. The steamer proved to be the Five Shower, homeward bound for New Zealand, and she took the Corinth castaways all the way to London. The stevedores and the screwing of the wool. The work of the stevedores cannot be underestimated. It was their job to load the wool, etc., into the ship safely and in a manner that didn't upset the balance of the ship. The captain, who knew the capabilities of his ship, would give instructions how he'd like it to be loaded. would not have been easy when cargo arrived in dribs and drabs. The wool bales were unloaded onto the wharf, where they would be compressed, usually sideways, into bundles of 2 bulls, 3 bulls or 4 bulls, and lashed together. 3 bulls were preferred. On lowering the bales into the hold, the crew would screw them tightly into place. There would be 4 navvies turning the windlass, and they would sing shanties to keep up a steady rhythm. Once securely in place, they would be secured with ropes or timber. The screw would be retracted and other general cargo would be slotted into the gap. The lashings holding the bales in place would then be loosened slightly. The bales would expand, and this extra force would make their stowage even more secure. That photo is actually of cotton bales. They're not wool bales, which is the only one I could find. But you can see here we've got the screw pushing out the ram, forcing the bales up, and then they lash them into place, retract the screw, put something in, bead more bales or whatever in the gap, and then loosen off a rope or 2 and they'll be there for good. The Decapolis began the London to Launceston trade in 1888 and continued till she was sold in 1896 following Mr. Walker's death. And that's her out next to the Customs House in Launceston. Some of the write-ups out of the newspapers made interesting reading. December 10, 1895. Yesterday was a busy day on board the bark, Decapolis, in consequence of today being fixed for commencing the homeward journey. The vessel shipped the last bale of wool on Saturday, and at night the hatches were battened down. Yesterday was general preparation day, and in the evening the ship looked a picture of neatness from keel to truck, and a large number of persons visited the vessel to bid their friends goodbye and wish them a pleasant trip. The Tasmania Wool Growers Association Agency Company Limited, local agents for the Decapolis, deserve credit for the quick dispatch given to the vessel, which had been loaded with 3,820 bales of wool, as against 3,750 bales last year, which reflects great credit on the officers of the ship and stevedore Mr. Carney. Although the Decapolis was later in starting to load this year, she has been dispatched 1 day earlier than last time, and as she is in fine trim, a quick run home should be made. And that other little bit up there is about William Lawrence, a seaman on the Decapolis, who was arrested on warrant, charging him with having, on the 3rd of the month, absented himself from the vessel. He admitted the offence and was ordered to go back to the ship on payment of 7 shillings and 6pence. I don't know if I'd have gone back. Put me in jail. Drownings on the Tamer in the northeast. The area around and along Queen's Wharf was very dangerous, especially at night. There are many obstacles, trip hazards and no safety barrier along the edge. Far too many people lost their lives in the river due to misadventure and alleged murders. Most of those that ended up in the water couldn't swim, and with their heavy boots and attire tended to sink straight to the bottom. If they were lucky, their screams were heard and a search commenced immediately, but more often than not, it wasn't until the next day, when they were found to be missing, that any sort of search would be undertaken. One of the luckiest of all who went in the river was Mr. Albert Hooper. And his story, which appeared in the Examiner on the 25th of August 1884, is as follows. An elderly man named Albert Hooper had a very narrow escape from drowning last evening at the Queen's Wharf near the bark Barine. It appears that early in the evening, Hooper went on board the Barine and after chatting to the sailors, left at 8:30 to head for home, but mistook the starboard side of the vessel for the port side of the vessel, fell off the boards into the river. I know boats. His cries were heard by 3 gentlemen passing by, and who immediately went to the assistance of Hooper. A rope was thrown from the vessel and fortunately caught by Hooper, who held on till a boat rescued him, and he was ultimately landed on the wharf, apparently none the worse for his cold bath. I wonder how many rums they'd had that night. I've included this little story for a reason which will come obvious a little bit later. 18th of January 1887, the Corinth had got to Town Point, unloaded its explosives, and then anchored in the river because it wasn't due in or couldn't come in till the next day. While they were unloading the explosives, a young 20-year-old apprentice, Arthur Walker, and a few of his mates arranged with someone on shore to come and get them after the captain had gone to bed and go out on the town, which they did. At about midnight, they decided it was time to head back to the boat, back to the Corinth. So they went down to the wharf, found a little flat-bottomed dinghy. 3 of them got in, rowed over to the Corinth, 2 got out and went on board. The other fellow came back and got Arthur Walker and the other 2 fellows. They hadn't gone far and it capsized. Arthur couldn't swim, and after a search, all they found was his coat. The other 2 fellows who eventually helped back onto the Corinth had to go and wake the captain and tell him what had happened. The next morning, Captain Littler went to the police, explained what had happened, and he left the police station with the expectation that the police would organise a boat and a search, because that's what happened in other jurisdictions he'd been involved in. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, when the captain had berthed the Corinth at the Queen's Wharf, that he found out that no police search had taken place. So he went back to the police station and he was basically told, that's not my job. They were not interested whatsoever. He wasn't impressed. Had he known that they wouldn't organise a search, he would have arranged a boat and got someone to go looking for young Arthur. He went back to the boat, got everything sorted, back to the Corinth, got all his crew organised, and was about to organise his own boat and search when he found out the police were actually down at the water seeing what they could do. This next little bit. This gives you an idea on the esteem that these clipper captains were held in. Captain Littler was so upset, he asked for or demanded a meeting. And he got a meeting between the full Marine Board, the full Launceston Council, the Superintendent of Police, and his next in charge. And the meeting was to determine whose responsibility is to search for and rescue or retrieve those in need. Captain Littler believed it was the police. Everybody else said it was up to the ship's captain. In fact, Alderman Button said as the captain's responsibility to his apprentices was akin to that of a parent, it was solely the captain's responsibility. There was much heated debate, and after several hours it was decided to set up a police committee to determine a resolution. You know what happens when things go to committees. But I did know that after then, anytime someone did end up in the water, it was the police that organised the boat. But the meeting that they had, there's 2 columns there out of the paper just on Arthur Walker's drowning. This went for about 8 columns. It was virtually the minutes of the meeting. And I've just brought it back to a short, only got a couple to go. The Monoma, 1876. We learn that a new iron bark intended for the Launceston trade was launched in Sutherland on the 4th of June and christened the Monoma. She was built to the order of Captain Walker and is owned by Captain Walker, Captain Tulloch and Captain Barwood, formerly of the bark Fugitive, who is to take command of her. The Monoma is 640 tonne register and will provide a valuable addition to our shipping interests. She was to load for this port and follow the Aruna. She first sailed to Launceston in 1876 and her final sailing to London left on the 23rd of December 1887. She was commanded by Captain Barwood until 1880 and was then captained by Captain Whittingham, and that is a sketch of Captain T.V. Whittingham. That long bit out of the paper, I won't read out. When all these ships came into port, the first thing that came off was the captain's log, and that was delivered to the newspaper. And you would read what time they left port, the coordinates, the exact coordinates when they crossed the equator, when they went round Cape of Good Hope, when they passed Cape Lewin, and if they passed another ship and they spoke, as in flags, you'd get a list of all the ships that they'd seen. Quite interesting reading. And it was reported that in September 1884, it was reported that the Monoma had included in its cargo the following: 500 bags of salt, 40 drums of carbolic acid, 300 cases of bottled beer, 50 cases of gin, 155 cases of port, and 1,067 barrels of rum. That's not a bad effort. The loss of the Monoma. The Monoma ran aground on the 8th of March 1888 near the Isle of Portland in the English Channel. She was totally destroyed, all cargo was lost, and Captain Whittingham, along with 13 of his crew, were drowned. According to the inquiry that followed this disaster, the loss of life may have been less had circumstances been slightly different. When she foundered, she fell seaward, with the waves crashing onto her deck. Had she capsized to the leeward side, it was thought that the crew may have been able to abandon ship safely. The Westbury was an iron bark which was launched in 1867. She came in at 493 tonne and was on the Tasmanian route until sold following Mr. Walker's death. The Eden Home. She was an iron bark built in Sunderland in 1875 at 794 tonne. She is 200 foot long. She sailed the London, Hobart and Launceston London route. After the sale of the Barine, Captain Wirral took over this ship until he retired, and it was replaced by Captain Dallin. The Eden Home was the last of the wool clippers. Steamers were larger and much faster, making them more efficient. The Eden Home on the 28th of September 1896. Saturday, this is her first visit to Launceston. On Saturday morning, the clipper bark Eden Home, one of the two vessels selected for the Launceston and London trade to replace the barks Decapolis, Marine and Westbury, put in an appearance off Tamer Heads, hailing from London via Hobart and being taken on tow by the tug Waibia into the river at 11:15. A short stoppage was made in Home Reach to discharge a quantity of explosives, and the vessel made fast to the new pier at 4:30. The Eden Home is about 300 tonne larger than the bark Marine, which traded to this port for many years, and to a certain extent on deck and below resembles that of the vessel. She is commanded by Captain Wirral, late of the Marine, who was congratulated on Saturday evening by a large number of friends on his return to Launceston. The bark Eden Home arrived at Hobart from London on the 18th of December 1906, unloaded part of her cargo, then continued on for Launceston on the 4th of January 1907. After a fast passage round the coast, the bark arrived off Tamer Heads at about 11 p.m. on the 6th and hove to await daylight and the arrival of the pilot. At 5:30 a.m. Dulling stood inshore, picking up the pilot at 8:10. The tug Waibia was expected to arrive about 1 to tow the bark up the river, but the pilot decided first to enter the heads and changed his mind and headed out again with the intention of dropping anchor in the open roadstead. However, when just west of Hebe Reef the wind died away, the Eden Home began to drift eastwards with the current. Although all on board expected the vessel would drift well clear of the Hebe Reef, it struck a sunken outcrop on the northern end of the reef, then swung round and held fast, within 120 yards of the wreck of the steamship S, lost in 1886. The survey on the following day revealed that the vessel lay with its hull from fore to mizzen mast lying on boulders, both ends being unsupported, and it strained badly, with the decks starting to open up. Those on board were removed safely and some of the cargo was retrieved. Artefacts are on view at the Pilot Station Museum. And I've run out of slides.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay, we've run out of slides, so we'll have to ask some questions. Anybody like to ask some questions or make a few comments? Who have we got? No questions?
They're all asleep.
No, it's very comprehensive. Yeah, excellent.
Right, well,